I am Eve. You've heard of me. I was the first woman, the first to live in paradise, and the first to lose it. My story isn't just about a mistake, it's about choices, love, loss, and redemption. I am not perfect, never was. But as you listen to my story, perhaps you'll see more than just a symbol. Perhaps you'll see yourself. The first sound I ever heard was the wind. It was gentle, like a tender touch caressing the trees and carrying with it the scent of blossoms. My eyes opened slowly, and the world unfolded before me in a burst of color and life. The sky was vast, painted in a deep, endless blue, and the ground was adorned with flowers that swayed softly with the breeze. Trees towered above me, their branches reaching out as though they were alive, their leaves reflecting the sunlight like shimmering mirrors. Everything was vibrant. Everything was perfect. I rose slowly, feeling the softness of the grass beneath my feet. Each step was a revelation. I touched a leaf and marveled at its delicate texture. I approached a stream and listened to the melody of its flowing waters. The garden was not merely a place, it felt alive, as if it breathed with me. Then I saw him. He was kneeling by the stream, his gaze fixed on the water's surface. Adam. When he noticed me, his expression changed, lighting up with curiosity and what seemed like relief. He stood and took a cautious step toward me. "You are like me," he said, his voice steady but tinged with wonder. "But different." "Yes," I whispered, though I wasn't entirely sure what it meant. Even without words, I felt the connection between us, a bond that seemed both natural and profound. Adam began showing me the garden. He spoke with enthusiasm, pointing out the plants, animals, and the names he had given them. "That is the olive tree," he said, gesturing to a sturdy tree nearby. "And over there, that's the antelope. Look at how it moves." As he spoke, I studied him. He seemed content, fulfilled, as though the garden provided him with everything he needed. But for me, there was something more. The garden was breathtakingly beautiful, but it didn't feel complete. There was an ache within me, a hunger for something I couldn't yet name. I spent my days exploring, marveling at the intricate details of the world around me. Yet my attention always returned to one tree at the center of the garden. Its leaves were greener than any other, its fruit more vibrant, as if it glowed with its own light. Adam barely acknowledged it, walking past it as though it didn't exist. But I couldn't look away. The first time I felt the presence of God, it was as though the air itself had been filled with warmth and light. There was no visible figure, but his presence was undeniable, enveloping everything around me. His voice echoed, soft yet authoritative, resonating through the garden. "Adam, Eve," he called, and we approached. His presence filled the space between us and the world he had created. He showed us the garden, explaining the purpose of everything within it. "All of this is for you," he said, his tone both firm and kind. "You may eat freely from every tree in the garden, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall not eat. For in the day that you eat of it, you shall surely die." Adam listened intently, nodding without hesitation. He seemed to accept God's words as absolute truth, like a child trusting a parent's instruction. I nodded as well, but something within me stirred. Why was this tree different from all the others? What did it mean to die? And why would something so beautiful be forbidden? The days that followed were peaceful for Adam. He worked in the garden, tending to the plants and observing the animals with joy. To him, the world was complete, and he seemed perfectly content. But I couldn't silence the questions forming within me. The forbidden tree lingered in my thoughts, growing like a shadow that refused to fade. One morning, Adam found me standing before it. "Why do you keep looking at this tree?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. "It's special," I said hesitantly. "It's not special," he replied firmly. "God has given us everything we need. We don't need this tree." I wanted to believe him. I wanted his certainty to calm the unease within me. But it wasn't enough. The tree seemed to call to me, even though I knew I shouldn't go near it. I began to avoid it, hoping to quiet my thoughts, but it stayed in my mind, like a secret waiting to be revealed. The questions didn't leave me. Why would God create something so beautiful only to forbid it? What was he protecting us from, or keeping from us? I pushed the thoughts aside as best I could, but deep down, I knew they would return. It was a peaceful morning in the garden, but my mind was restless. Adam was busy tending to the animals, while I wandered alone. My steps, as if guided by something beyond my will, led me back to the tree at the center. It stood as it always did, its leaves shimmering and its fruit glowing softly in the sunlight. It seemed alive, pulsating with an unseen energy. I stood before it, studying the way its branches swayed gently in the breeze. The fruit looked more inviting than anything I had ever seen, as if it held promises too great to resist. The same questions returned, unanswered and persistent. Why had God forbidden this tree? Why would something so beautiful be untouchable? And what was death, the consequence he had warned us about? Curious, aren't you? The voice came softly, breaking the silence. Startled, I turned and saw the serpent, coiled around a low branch. Its skin gleamed with hues of green and gold, catching the light like jewels. Its eyes glinted with intelligence and something else, something I couldn't place. Who are you? I asked, my voice trembling slightly. Just an observer, it replied, its tone smooth and disarming. It moved with a fluid grace, slithering closer on the branch. But you, Eve, what are you looking for? Why are you here? I don't know, I admitted, though the words tasted strange on my tongue. There's something about this tree that I can't seem to ignore. The serpent tilted its head, as though pondering my answer. And have you never wondered why? Why God would give you everything but keep this one thing from you? What is he hiding? He said we would die, I replied, repeating God's words. But even as I spoke, the certainty in my voice wavered. Die? The serpent let out a soft, almost amused sound. And do you know what that means? Have you seen death, Eve? Or is it possible that he wants to keep you from something greater? Something greater? My heartbeat quickened. The serpent's words echoed the questions that had already taken root in my mind. Yes, it said, its voice soothing yet firm. He knows that if you eat this fruit, your eyes will be opened. You will be like him, knowing good and evil. Perhaps he fears what you might become. The serpent's words were intoxicating. Could it be true? Could God be holding us back from something? I looked at the tree again, and the fruit seemed even brighter, its allure almost irresistible. The serpent slipped back into the shadows, its words lingering like a melody. For the first time, doubt blossomed in my heart. And with it, a yearning I couldn't deny, a hunger for answers. Days passed, but I couldn't stop thinking about the serpent's words. The image of the tree stayed with me, even when I tried to focus on other things. At night, I dreamed of the fruit, waking with its sweet scent haunting me. Adam noticed my unease. What's wrong, Eve? He asked one afternoon as we tended the plants together. Nothing, I lied, avoiding his gaze. But I could tell he wasn't convinced. You're thinking about the tree, he said, his voice tinged with concern. Let it go. God has given us everything we need. I know, I said softly. I wanted to believe him, to let his words calm the storm inside me. But they didn't. Something within me refused to let go. That evening, as Adam tended to the animals, I found myself walking back to the tree. Each step felt heavier than the last, as if the very earth was trying to hold me back. When I reached it, the garden seemed to fall silent. Even the wind had stilled, as though the world was waiting. My hand trembled as I reached out. I touched one of the fruits, its surface smooth and cool beneath my fingers. It seemed to pulse softly, as if alive. I lifted it to my face, inhaling its sweet, intoxicating scent. My heart raced as I closed my eyes and took the first bite. The taste was beyond anything I had ever experienced. It was sweet, but also rich and overwhelming, as if the fruit contained the essence of life itself. As I chewed, I felt a shift deep within me. It was as though a veil had been lifted, revealing a world sharper, more vivid, but also heavier. I looked around, and the garden seemed different. The air felt colder, the colors darker. And then I looked at myself and saw my nakedness for the first time. A wave of shame washed over me, burning my cheeks. Adam arrived moments later. He stopped when he saw me holding the bitten fruit, his eyes wide with fear. Eve, what have you done? He asked, his voice trembling. Eat, I said, extending the fruit toward him. Please. He hesitated, his hand trembling as he took it. Slowly, he bit into the fruit. As he chewed, I saw his expression change. His eyes widened, just as mine had, and he looked at himself, then at me. Without a word, he began pulling leaves from nearby trees to cover himself. I did the same, my mind spinning. The garden was no longer the paradise it had been. The wind felt harsh against my skin, and the shadows stretched longer than before. Deep in my heart, I knew what was coming. God would call for us. The garden had never been this quiet. The air seemed heavy, laden with an unspoken tension. Adam and I sat among the trees, trembling, our bodies hastily covered with leaves. My heart pounded in my chest, a rhythm of fear and regret. Then, his voice came, shattering the stillness. "Adam, where are you?" It wasn't a question from someone searching, it was a summons from someone who already knew. Adam looked at me, his face pale with fear. He took a deep, shaky breath and called out, "I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid myself." There was a pause, and then his voice came again, firm and unyielding. "Who told you that you were naked? Have you eaten from the tree of which I commanded you not to eat?" Adam hesitated, his gaze dropping to the ground. "The woman you gave to be with me," he said, his voice almost breaking, "she gave me the fruit of the tree, and I ate." The words hit me like a blow. He was right, but hearing it aloud made the weight of my actions unbearable. I looked away, unable to meet Adam's or God's gaze. "Eve," God said, his voice turning to me. It wasn't filled with anger, but with a heaviness that pierced my soul. "What have you done?" Tears spilled down my face as I whispered, "The serpent deceived me, and I ate." The silence that followed was unbearable, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves. Then, God turned his attention to the serpent. His voice became a force of judgment, echoing with power. "Because you have done this, you are cursed more than all livestock, and more than any beast of the field. On your belly you shall go, and you shall eat dust all the days of your life. I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He shall bruise your head, and you shall bruise his heel." The serpent coiled tightly, its once glittering skin now dull. It slithered into the shadows, silent and defeated. God turned back to me, his voice still steady but heavy with sadness. "I will greatly multiply your pain in childbirth. In pain you shall bring forth children. Your desire shall be for your husband, and he shall rule over you." Each word struck me like a blow, yet there was no anger in his tone, only a profound sorrow. I bowed my head, my tears falling freely. I didn't fully understand the weight of his words, but I felt their permanence. Finally, God turned to Adam. "Because you have heeded the voice of your wife and have eaten from the tree of which I commanded you, saying, 'You shall not eat of it,' cursed is the ground for your sake. In toil you shall eat of it all the days of your life. Both thorns and thistles it shall bring forth for you, and you shall eat the herb of the field. By the sweat of your face you shall eat bread till you return to the ground, for out of it you were taken. For dust you are, and to dust you shall return." Adam dropped to his knees, his hands digging into the soil as though trying to find solace in the earth. The garden, once a place of joy and abundance, now felt suffocating. The colors seemed muted, and the air carried a sense of loss. Then came the final decree. God expelled us from the garden. He placed cherubim with a flaming sword at the entrance, a barrier we could never cross. The sight of the blazing light against the lush green was seared into my memory. As we walked away, I turned to look back one last time. The garden was radiant, its beauty untouched by the sorrow I now carried. Tears streamed down my face, but amidst the grief, I felt something else, a flicker of determination. We had lost paradise, but we were still alive. Somehow, we would have to find a way to continue. The world outside the garden was nothing like the paradise we had known. The earth was unyielding, the ground rough and dotted with stones and thorns. The vibrant colors of the garden had been replaced by muted tones of struggle. Each step we took into this new reality felt heavier, and every task demanded more effort than we could have imagined. The first days were the hardest. Adam threw himself into the work. He spent hours laboring in the fields, breaking the ground with his hands, trying to coax life from the barren soil. His face, once filled with wonder and contentment, now carried a shadow of guilt. At night, he prayed softly, his voice barely audible over the crackle of the small fire that warmed us. I listened, but my own prayers were different. I didn't ask for forgiveness, I sought understanding. Was God still with us? Could He still hear us, even now? The nights were cold, colder than anything we had ever experienced. I missed the gentle warmth of the garden, the way the wind carried life rather than chill. But in these moments of shared silence, something grew between Adam and me. A bond forged not in perfection, but in shared struggle. When our first son was born, the world shifted. The pain of childbirth was excruciating, as God had said it would be. It felt like my body was being torn apart. But when Cain's first cry filled the air, the agony faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of love. I held him close, his tiny form fitting perfectly in my arms. In that moment, I caught a glimpse of Eden again, a reminder that even outside paradise, beauty could still be created. Soon after, Abel was born. He was different from Cain. Where Cain was intense and full of energy, Abel was calm and gentle, almost ethereal. The two boys brought light into our lives, and for a time, it felt as though we had found a kind of balance. It wasn't the garden, but it was life. As the years passed, our family grew, but so did the weight of our burdens. Cain worked the fields with the same intensity as Adam, his hands calloused from the relentless labor. Yet there was something in his eyes, a restlessness, a longing for something I couldn't name. Abel, on the other hand, tended the flocks with a quiet contentment that seemed to elude his brother. He found peace in his work, his connection to the animals almost sacred. The differences between them became more pronounced as they grew older. Cain's determination often bordered on frustration, while Abel's calm demeanor seemed to aggravate his brother. I tried to bridge the gap between them, but the tension was like an invisible force, growing stronger with each passing day. The day came when they offered sacrifices to God. Cain brought the fruits of his labor, the yield of his toil in the fields. Abel brought the best of his flock, offering their fat portions. Adam and I stood nearby, watching silently. When God accepted Abel's offering but not Cain's, the divide between them deepened. Cain's expression darkened as he stared at the ground, his fists clenched at his sides. He avoided my gaze, retreating to the fields without a word. Later that evening, I found him sitting alone, his shoulders hunched under the weight of his thoughts. "Why does he favor Abel?" he asked, his voice low and bitter. "What's wrong with me?" I sat beside him, searching for the right words. "God sees the heart, Cain. He sees your dedication too. Trust in him." "Trust?" he said with a bitter laugh. "I've trusted him my whole life. And for what?" His words stung, and I reached for his hand, but he pulled away. He stood and walked into the darkness, leaving me with a gnawing sense of unease. Something in his voice, in his posture, told me that this was not the end of his anger. I prayed silently, hoping that time would soften his heart. But in the days that followed, Cain grew more withdrawn. He avoided Abel, choosing to work alone. Abel seemed to sense the change, but he said nothing, continuing his work with quiet diligence. The tension in our home was palpable, an invisible weight that pressed down on all of us. One morning, as the sun rose and the fields shimmered with dew, I watched from a distance as Cain approached Abel. His movements were deliberate, his voice carrying through the still air. "Come with me," he said, motioning toward a field further away. There was no warmth in his tone, but neither was there outright hostility. Abel hesitated for a moment before following him. I stood at the edge of the field, watching them disappear over the hill. My chest tightened with a growing sense of dread, but I pushed it aside. Surely, I thought, they would work it out. They were brothers. The morning seemed like any other. The sun rose slowly, casting its golden light over the fields, and Adam was already hard at work. From a distance, I saw Cain and Abel together in the fields. Abel guided his flock to graze, his movements calm and steady. Cain stood nearby, gripping his tools with tense determination. But something felt different. The air was heavier, as if it carried a warning. Cain called out to Abel, his voice sharp and deliberate. "Come over here," he said, pointing toward a distant field. Abel hesitated for a moment, his hand brushing against one of his sheep, but then he nodded and followed. I watched them disappear beyond the hill, a knot of unease tightening in my chest. I tried to distract myself with my tasks, but my mind kept wandering to them. Time seemed to slow, each moment stretching painfully. Then, I heard it, a sound that shattered the stillness. It wasn't a cry, but a dull, heavy thud, like something falling to the earth. My heart froze. "Adam!" I shouted, dropping everything and running toward the field. Adam looked up from his work, alarmed, and quickly followed. We climbed the hill together, and what we saw stopped us in our tracks. Abel lay on the ground, motionless. Blood pooled beneath his head, soaking into the earth. Cain stood over him, a bloodied stone in his hand. His face was blank, his eyes fixed on Abel's lifeless body as though he couldn't comprehend what he had done. "Cain!" I screamed, my voice breaking. I ran to Abel, falling to my knees beside him. I touched his face, but it was cold, his body still. Tears streamed down my face as I cradled him, my cries echoing through the empty fields. Adam knelt beside me, his hand trembling as he reached for Abel. He held him gently, his voice a choked whisper. "Why? Why did this happen?" His tears fell silently, his grief too heavy for words. Cain dropped the stone, and it landed with a dull thud. He finally looked at us, but his expression was unreadable, a mix of anger, shame, and something else. "Am I my brother's keeper?" he muttered, his voice low, almost a whisper. Before I could respond, God's voice thundered through the air. It was filled with sorrow, not anger, but its weight was undeniable. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Cain fell to his knees, his head bowed, but he said nothing. God's voice continued, unyielding and heavy with judgment. "Now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you till the ground, it shall no longer yield its strength to you. A fugitive and a wanderer you shall be on the earth." Cain looked up, his voice trembling with despair. "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you have driven me from the ground, and from your presence I shall be hidden. Whoever finds me will kill me." God responded, his voice filled with both firmness and compassion. "Therefore, whoever kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." Then, God placed a mark upon Cain, so that no one would harm him. Cain rose slowly, his movements heavy, but he didn't look back. He began to walk away, his steps faltering but resolute. Something inside me broke as I watched him leave. I ran after him, my hands reaching out. "Cain, please. Don't go." But he didn't stop. His final words were quiet, almost carried away by the wind. "I don't belong here anymore." I stood still, watching him disappear into the horizon. That day, I lost 2 sons, one to death, the other to exile. The grief was unbearable, and the guilt burned within me like a fire that refused to die. The days that followed Abel's death were the quietest I had ever known. The world around us felt empty, as though it too mourned his absence. The fields seemed barren, the wind colder. At night, I lay awake, haunted by memories of Abel's laughter and Cain's defiant gaze. I wondered where Cain was now, if he had found peace, or if the mark upon him had become his only companion. Adam and I continued to live side by side, but the loss had created a rift between us. He buried himself in his work, pushing his body to its limits as though he could bury his grief in the soil. I found solace in our other children, in the small moments of joy they brought, but the emptiness left by Abel and Cain's absence was like a wound that refused to heal. One evening, after the children had gone to sleep, Adam and I sat beneath the stars. He reached for my hand, a gesture that was rare these days. "Do you regret it, Eve?" he asked, his voice quiet and heavy. I looked at the sky, the stars shining faintly above us. "I don't know if regret is the right word," I replied after a long pause. "I feel sorrow. I feel longing. But I think we've learned something we never would have otherwise." He nodded slowly, but said nothing more. The wind rustled softly through the trees, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the world seemed a little less heavy. That night, as the stars watched silently from above, I prayed, "Lord, I don't understand everything that has happened. Perhaps I never will. But I know that you are still here, even in this broken world. The love we share, the life we have built, it is proof that you are with us." For the first time since leaving the garden, I felt a peace, not of perfection, but of acceptance. The garden was lost to us, but the life we had created outside its gates was ours, filled with mistakes, love, pain, and the promise of redemption. My story is not about perfection. It is about humanity. Perhaps that is what God always intended, that we learn to fall, but also to rise again. To love, even in the midst of suffering. To carry on, even when the weight of the world feels too much. If you found inspiration in Eve's story and her journey of love, loss, and redemption, imagine the wisdom you can gain from the other extraordinary women of the Bible. In our ebook, The Virtues of Women in the Bible, Timeless Lessons for Modern Life, you'll uncover the faith of Hannah, the courage of Esther, the wisdom of Abigail, the loyalty of Ruth, and the devotion of Mary. Each of their stories holds timeless lessons that can empower you to face your challenges with strength and purpose. Scan the QR code on the screen or click the first pinned comment to access this transformative guide and let their virtues shape your journey today.